You know that moment when everything you thought you knew about love gets shattered into a million pieces? When the person you trusted most looks you in the eye and tells you that everything was a lie? Well, that's exactly where Theodore Colton found himself 2 years ago, standing in his $8 million penthouse, divorce papers in one hand, his heart in the other. His wife Jennifer had just walked out the door with his former business partner. Not just any business partner, his best friend since college. The man who'd been best man at their wedding. The man who'd held his daughter Matilda when she was born. And now? Now he was the man taking half of Theodore's fortune and all of his trust in humanity. "You never understood what I needed," Jennifer had said, her designer heels clicking against the marble floor one last time. "Richard gets it. He gets that a woman like me needs more than just this." She'd gestured dismissively at their life together, the penthouse, the art, the view of the city that most people would kill for. "I need someone who knows how to really live." What she meant, Theodore realized later, was someone with even more money, more connections, more status. Because apparently, being worth $43 million wasn't enough. Apparently, owning a tech empire that employed hundreds of people wasn't impressive enough. Apparently, loving someone with your whole heart meant nothing if someone richer came along. That night, as Theodore stood alone in rooms that suddenly felt too big and too empty, he made himself a promise. A vow, really. He would never again be loved for his money. Never again would he wonder if someone's smile was real or if they were just calculating the zeros in his bank account. So he started testing them. 25 women over 18 months. 25 carefully orchestrated dates where he'd show up in Goodwill clothes and drive a beat-up Honda Civic that barely started. 25 dinners where he'd suddenly forget his wallet and watch their faces change. 25 opportunities to see who these women really were when the money was off the table. The results were predictably heartbreaking. Woman after woman showed their true colors the moment they thought he couldn't pay. Some made excuses before the appetizers arrived. Others suddenly remembered urgent phone calls from sick relatives. One woman, a pediatric nurse who spent her days caring for sick children, actually laughed in his face when he said he couldn't afford dessert. "Are you serious right now?" she'd said, loud enough for half the restaurant to hear. "I don't have time for broke guys who can't even spring for tiramisu." Each rejection confirmed what Jennifer had taught him. Love was just another transaction. Everyone had a price. Everyone was looking for what they could get, until he saw her. Theodore almost didn't stop at Mickey's diner that Tuesday afternoon. He'd just walked out on date number 23, a marketing executive who'd ordered the lobster special and champagne, then discovered a family emergency the exact moment his card was declined. He was driving aimlessly through neighborhoods he'd never noticed before, feeling that familiar hollow ache in his chest, when he spotted the little diner with its flickering neon sign. Through the window, he watched a waitress with dark hair pulled back in a messy bun as she moved between tables. When an elderly man's shaking hand knocked over his water glass, Theodore expected the usual eye roll, the barely concealed annoyance of someone who'd been on her feet too long. Instead, she smiled. A real smile, warm and genuine, the kind Theodore hadn't seen in months. She cleaned up the spill without a hint of irritation, asked if the man needed anything else, and even patted his shoulder gently before moving on. Something about that moment stopped Theodore's car. Something about her kindness to a stranger who couldn't give her anything in return. He parked and went inside. "You keep ordering black coffee and sitting here for 2 hours," Hazel said on his fourth visit, a hint of amusement dancing in her tired eyes. "Either you really love our coffee, or you're working up the courage to say something." Theodore felt heat creep up his neck. Was he that obvious? "Little bit," she continued, refilling his mug even though it was still half full. "So what is it? You selling something? Because I've got to tell you, I can't afford whatever it is." There it was, that easy honesty about money that most people danced around. No shame, no apology, just fact. "No," Theodore laughed, despite himself. "I was wondering if you'd maybe want to get coffee sometime. Somewhere that's not here, though I totally understand if your answer is no, given that you probably see enough coffee at work." Hazel studied him for a long moment, and Theodore wondered what she saw. He'd dressed carefully for these visits, faded jacket from Goodwill, old jeans, scuffed sneakers. His $47,000 watch sat in his nightstand drawer next to the wedding ring he'd finally stopped wearing. "I work 70 hours a week between here and the grocery store," Hazel said carefully. "I've got a 15-year-old brother who needs me. I don't really have time for dating." "Just coffee then," Theodore said quickly. 30 minutes. You pick when and where." She bit her lip, and Theodore noticed the dark circles under her eyes, the way her uniform was faded from too many washes, the small bandage on her thumb that probably covered a kitchen burn. "Thursday afternoon," she said finally. "There's a park 2 blocks from here. Bring your own coffee, though. I'll be off the clock." That Thursday afternoon changed everything. Hazel showed up in jeans and a sweater that had been carefully mended at the elbow, her hair down around her shoulders for the first time. She was even more beautiful without the harsh diner lighting, but it was something else that made Theodore's carefully constructed plan start to crack. She told him about Carlos, her brother, with the same matter-of-fact tone she'd used about not being able to afford things. Degenerative muscle condition, physical therapy 3 times a week. Their parents had died in a car accident 3 years ago, leaving her to raise a teenager while working multiple jobs just to keep their heads above water. "That must be incredibly hard," Theodore said quietly. Hazel shrugged. "It is what it is. I'm all he's got." Then she took a sip of their gas station coffee and made such a face that Theodore burst out laughing. "God, this is terrible," she said. "Why did I suggest bringing our own? I thought it was pretty bad too, but I didn't want to insult your recommendation." "I work at a diner," Hazel grinned. "I have no excuse for bad coffee recommendations." That smile did something to Theodore's chest, something dangerous and wonderful and terrifying all at once. "So, what's your story?" Hazel asked, and Theodore slipped easily into the lies he'd rehearsed. Tech support, small apartment across town, 8-year-old daughter named Matilda with joint custody after a bitter divorce. The conversation flowed like water finding its level. Hazel talked about Carlos's small victories, how he'd managed to hold a fork by himself the week before, how his physical therapist thought the new medication might be helping. Theodore found himself sharing real things about Matilda, about her obsession with astronomy, and how she made him lie on the floor to point out constellations on the glow-in-the-dark stars stuck to her ceiling. He didn't mention the ceiling was 14 feet high in a penthouse worth $8 million. Their 30 minutes turned into 2 hours. When Hazel finally checked her phone and jumped up with a curse, she was going to be late for her grocery store shift, Theodore felt something close to panic. "Can I see you again?" The question came out more desperate than he'd intended. Hazel hesitated, slinging her bag over her shoulder. "I don't know if that's a good idea." "Why not?" "Because I can't afford to date someone right now, Theodore. I mean that literally. Every dollar I make goes to Carlos's medical bills or keeping a roof over our heads. I can't do dinners or movies or whatever normal people do. And you seem really nice, so I don't want to waste your time." This was perfect. She'd just handed him exactly what he needed. A woman who couldn't afford anything, who would be the ultimate test of whether someone could love him without wealth. But the words that came out surprised him. "What if we just do this? Parks, bad coffee, talking. I'm not exactly rolling in money either." Hazel searched his face for something. "Okay," she said finally. "Yeah, let's do this again." As Theodore watched her hurry away to her second job, he told himself this was still just another test. But deep down, he was starting to suspect that maybe, just maybe, he was the one being tested instead. Their second date was supposed to be the real test. Theodore had chosen Rossetti's, a cozy Italian place that wasn't expensive, but nice enough that the bill would matter to someone counting every penny. Nice enough to see what Hazel would do when reality hit. She arrived 10 minutes late, slightly breathless and apologetic. "Sorry, Carlos had a rough day. Took longer to get him settled than I expected." "Is he okay?" Theodore asked, and was surprised to find he genuinely wanted to know the answer. "Yeah, just one of those days where his muscles don't want to cooperate. He gets frustrated, you know?" She slid into the booth across from him, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. She'd changed out of her work uniform into a simple blue dress that looked thrifted but suited her perfectly. "His nurse is with him now, though, so we're good." They ordered. Hazel chose the cheapest pasta on the menu despite Theodore's encouragement to get whatever she wanted, and fell into that same easy conversation that had surprised him at the park. She told him about a customer who'd left a $50 tip that morning, how she'd almost cried in the walk-in freezer because it meant she could finally buy Carlos that science textbook he'd been wanting. Theodore's chest tightened. He could buy 1,000 textbooks without thinking twice. Hell, he could probably buy the publishing company. Instead, he nodded and said, "That's amazing. Carlos is lucky to have you." When the check came, Theodore executed his plan with practiced precision. He pulled out his wallet, made a show of checking inside, then let his face fall into carefully rehearsed embarrassment. "Oh no," he said, patting his jacket pockets. "I could have sworn I grabbed my debit card this morning. I must have left it at home." This was the moment. This was where 23 other women had shown their true colors. "Hey, it's okay," Hazel said, already reaching for her purse. "Happens to me at least once a week. I've got it." Theodore watched her pull out two $20 bills, probably tip money from the diner, money she needed for rent or groceries or Carlos's medication. She handed them to the waitress without hesitation, without disappointment flickering across her face, without suddenly remembering somewhere else she needed to be. She just smiled at him like it genuinely didn't matter. "I'll pay you back," Theodore said, hating himself more with each word. "Don't worry about it. You can get the next one." Hazel stood, gathering her coat. "I should head home anyway. Early shift tomorrow." As Theodore drove home that night, past neighborhoods Hazel would never see, up to a penthouse she couldn't imagine, he told himself he felt triumphant. She'd passed another test. So why did he feel like he wanted to throw up? Their third date was a walk through downtown because Theodore's car had broken down. Another lie, another test. His actual car, a Tesla Model S, sat in his private parking garage while he drove the beat-up Honda Civic he'd bought specifically for this charade. "I don't mind walking," Hazel said when he apologized for the third time. "I walk everywhere anyway. Gas prices are insane, and the bus system here is actually pretty decent." They walked for hours as the sun set and the city lights began to twinkle. Hazel told him about her parents, how her mom used to sing while cooking dinner, how her dad read Carlos bedtime stories in different character voices. "I tried to keep up the voices after they died," she said quietly, "but I'm terrible at it. Carlos laughs anyway, which I think is more out of pity than anything else." Theodore found himself sharing things he'd never told anyone, about how Matilda had nightmares after the divorce, about how she'd asked him if Mommy left because she didn't love her anymore, about the guilt that ate at him every time he worked late, every time he missed a school event, every time he felt like he was failing at the one thing that truly mattered. "You're not failing," Hazel said firmly. They'd stopped walking, standing under a streetlight on an empty corner. "Matilda's loved. That's what matters. Trust me, as someone who's raising a kid, it's not about being perfect. It's about showing up." She held his gaze. "You show up for Carlos every single day, and you show up for Matilda. Stop being so hard on yourself." Something shifted in that moment. Theodore felt the carefully constructed walls he'd built start to crumble, and it terrified him. This was supposed to be a test, a way to prove that people were predictable, that everyone had a breaking point, that his ex-wife had been right about human nature. But Hazel kept not breaking. Their fourth date was coffee at the park again. Their fifth was a free outdoor concert where they sat on the grass and talked until Hazel fell asleep on his shoulder during the second half. Theodore sat perfectly still for 45 minutes, afraid to wake her, thinking about how she worked 70 hours a week and probably hadn't had an uninterrupted moment of peace in years. By their sixth date, Theodore knew he was in serious trouble. They were at a street fair, walking past booths selling handmade jewelry and overpriced lemonade. Matilda had begged to come along. She'd been asking about Daddy's friend for weeks, and Theodore had reluctantly agreed after getting Hazel's permission. Watching them together made his throat tight with emotion he wasn't prepared for. Hazel didn't talk down to Matilda or use that weird, patronizing voice some adults used with children. She just talked to her like a person, asking about her favorite planets and listening intently to an 8-year-old's rambling explanation of black holes. "Can Hazel come to my school play?" Matilda asked as they shared a funnel cake, powdered sugar dusting her chin. Please, Daddy. She said she likes theater. Theodore looked at Hazel, expecting her to make an excuse. Instead, she smiled. When is it? Next Thursday at 7. I work until 6, but I can make it work, Hazel said, catching Theodore's eye. If that's okay with you. It wasn't okay. It was the opposite of okay because Theodore was falling in love with someone he was actively lying to, and every day the lie got bigger and harder to maintain. He had no idea how to stop it without losing everything. Yeah, he heard himself say. That would be great. That night, after dropping Matilda off at Jennifer's house, Theodore stood in his penthouse living room and really looked at the life he'd built. The furniture that cost more than most people made in a year, the art on the walls, the view of the city stretching out below him like a kingdom he'd conquered. None of it meant anything. He thought about Hazel in her small apartment with her mended sweaters and her tip money carefully saved for her brother's textbook. He thought about how she'd paid for dinner without a second thought, how she'd fallen asleep on his shoulder because she trusted him, how she'd talked to Matilda like she mattered. Theodore pulled out his phone and stared at his assistant's number. One call. That's all it would take. He could have a complete background check on Hazel within hours, could verify every story she'd told him, confirm she was who she said she was, prove this was all real. His finger hovered over the call button. He put the phone down. Because if he checked, if he verified, if he turned this into just another transaction, then he was no better than his ex-wife. No better than all the people who'd taught him that love was something you could buy or sell or negotiate. But he couldn't stop lying either, because the truth meant admitting he'd been testing her, manipulating her, treating her like a lab rat in his twisted experiment with human nature. There was no good way out of this. Hazel showed up to Matilda's play wearing that same blue dress from their second date. She'd clearly come straight from work, her hair still up in its waitress bun. And she'd brought Carlos. Theodore's heart stopped when he saw them in the school auditorium. Carlos in his wheelchair, Hazel pushing him carefully down the aisle, both of them scanning the crowd for familiar faces. She'd brought her brother, the person she was sacrificing everything for, to meet his daughter. That meant something. That meant she was letting him into her real life, the parts that mattered most. After the play, Matilda insisted they all go for ice cream. Theodore's mind raced, calculating costs, wondering if he should forget his wallet again, or if that would be pushing too far. My treat, Hazel announced before he could speak. Matilda was amazing tonight. We're celebrating. Hazel, you don't have to. I want to. Besides, I actually got a raise this week. 25 cents an hour, but hey, big money, right? She said it like a joke, but Theodore heard the genuine pride underneath. 25 cents an hour mattered when you were counting every dollar. They crowded around a small table outside the ice cream shop. Theodore, Hazel, Carlos, Matilda, and Jennifer, who'd been checking her phone with barely concealed impatience all evening. She's really great with kids, Jennifer said quietly, nodding toward Hazel as they watched her help Carlos with his ice cream. Where'd you find her? A diner. Well, she's good for Matilda, I can tell. After Jennifer left with Matilda, it was just the three of them. The night had turned cool, and Hazel shivered in her thin jacket. Here, Theodore said, starting to take off his coat. I'm fine, Hazel protested, but he draped it over her shoulders anyway. Carlos grinned. You guys are cute. It's disgusting. Carlos! Hazel's face flushed pink. What? It's true. Carlos looked at Theodore with the brutal honesty only teenagers possessed. You make my sister smile. She doesn't smile enough, so thanks, I guess. Theodore felt something crack completely open in his chest. Not the careful crack he'd been managing for weeks. This was a full break, messy and irreparable. You're embarrassing me, Hazel muttered. Good, you embarrass me all the time. Carlos wheeled himself a few feet away, giving them space. I'm gonna look at that bookstore window. Come get me when you're done being gross. Hazel laughed, shaking her head. Then she looked at Theodore, and her expression grew serious. Thank you for tonight, for including Carlos. Most guys I've dated, back when I had time to date, they didn't want to deal with a brother in a wheelchair. Most guys are idiots, Theodore said. Yeah. Hazel moved closer, close enough that he could smell her shampoo, something simple and clean, probably from the drugstore. You're not like most guys, are you? Theodore thought about his penthouse, his company, his bank account, the elaborate lie he'd constructed around himself. No, he said quietly. I'm really not. Hazel kissed him then, soft and careful, like she was asking a question. Theodore kissed her back, tasting chocolate ice cream and knowing with absolute certainty that he was about to destroy the best thing that had happened to him in years, because he couldn't keep lying to her. Not anymore. Not when she looked at him like he was worth something beyond his bank account, worth something real and true. But telling her the truth meant she'd know he'd been testing her, manipulating her, lying to her for weeks. As Theodore drove home that night, he made a decision that terrified him more than any business deal ever had. Tomorrow, he would tell Hazel everything. Theodore didn't sleep that night. He sat in his home office, staring at his phone like it might spontaneously combust, rehearsing the words he'd say to Hazel. Every version sounded worse than the last. I'm sorry, but I've been lying to you. I'm actually a millionaire. Remember when I pretended to forget my wallet? That was a test. Everything you thought you knew about me is fake. By morning, he'd drafted and deleted 17 different text messages asking her to meet him. Finally, he just called. Hey, Hazel answered, sounding tired. Everything okay? You never call this early. Can we meet today? It's important. A pause. Theodore, you're scaring me. What's going on? I just need to talk to you. Please. Okay, the park around too? Yeah, thank you. After he hung up, Theodore sat in the silence of his penthouse and wondered if this would be the last time she'd agree to see him. At 1:30, Theodore was already at the park, sitting on their usual bench. He'd changed clothes 3 times, finally settling on the same worn jacket and jeans he always wore around her. It felt wrong now, like a costume he couldn't wait to take off. Hazel arrived exactly at 2, and Theodore's heart seized at the sight of her. She was wearing her work uniform, clearly coming from a morning shift. Her hair was falling out of its bun, and she had that exhausted look he'd come to recognize and hate, not because it wasn't beautiful, but because he knew what caused it. But she smiled when she saw him. That genuine, warm smile that made him feel like the worst person alive. Okay, you've got me worried, Hazel said, sitting down beside him. What's so important that you're acting all mysterious? Theodore took a breath that felt like swallowing glass. Just say it. Just tell her. I haven't been honest with you. Hazel's smile faded slowly, like a light dimming. What do you mean? I mean... Theodore forced himself to look at her, to see the confusion and growing concern in her eyes. I'm not who you think I am. I don't work in tech support. I own a tech company, a successful one. I don't live in a small apartment. I have a penthouse downtown. My car didn't break down. I didn't forget my wallet. And I'm not struggling financially. The words hung between them like a toxic cloud. Hazel stared at him, her expression cycling through confusion, disbelief, and something that looked dangerously close to hurt. I don't understand, she said quietly. I'm a millionaire, Hazel. I have been this whole time. Everything I told you about my finances was a lie. The silence stretched between them like broken glass. Theodore watched emotions flicker across Hazel's face, faster than he could catalog them. When she finally spoke, her voice was so small he almost missed it. Why? Because I wanted to know if someone could love me for who I am, not what I have. The words tumbled out now, desperate and clumsy. My ex-wife cheated on me with my business partner. She left me for someone with more money, more connections. The divorce taught me that people only care about what you can give them. So I started testing women, pretending to be broke on dates, seeing who would stay. Testing? Hazel repeated the word like it was foreign, like she'd never heard it before. You were testing me? Yes. No, I mean... Theodore ran his hand through his hair, suddenly feeling like he was drowning. At first, yes. But then it became real. You became real, and I didn't know how to stop lying without losing you. Hazel stood up so abruptly that Theodore startled. I need to think. Hazel, please. No. She held up her hand, and Theodore saw it was shaking. You let me pay for dinner with my tip money. Money I needed for Carlos's medication. You watched me worry about whether I could afford gas, whether I could take an afternoon off work. And the whole time you were, what? Taking notes? Seeing if the poor girl would pass your test? It wasn't like that. Then what was it like, Theodore? Her voice cracked on his name. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you played games with someone who didn't have the luxury of playing games back. Panic rose in Theodore's chest like bile. I know I messed up. I know I should have told you sooner, but everything else was real. The way I feel about you, the way I feel about Carlos, all our conversations, that was all real. How am I supposed to know what's real? Hazel wrapped her arms around herself like she was trying to hold herself together. You lied about everything. For all I know, you lied about having feelings, too. I didn't. I swear I didn't. I don't know if I can believe you. Hazel's eyes were filling with tears, and Theodore had never hated himself more. I thought you understood me. I thought you knew what it was like to struggle, to worry about money, to feel like you're barely keeping your head above water, but you were just pretending. You were a tourist in my life. That's not fair. Fair. Hazel laughed, but there was no humor in it, only pain. You want to talk about fair? I work 70 hours a week to keep my brother alive. I haven't bought myself new clothes in 2 years. I ate cereal for dinner last week because I had to choose between feeding myself and paying for Carlos's physical therapy. And you were playing dress up in Goodwill clothes and watching me like I was some kind of social experiment. Hazel, I need to go. She was already walking away, moving fast. I need to think. Don't call me. Theodore watched her leave, every instinct screaming at him to chase after her, to fix this, to make her understand. But he stayed on the bench because maybe that's what he deserved, to sit alone with the consequences of his choices. 3 days passed like a slow-motion car crash. Theodore called twice. Hazel didn't answer. He texted nothing back. He showed up at the diner, but her manager said she'd called in sick. Matilda noticed immediately. Where's Hazel? Is she coming over this weekend? I don't think so, sweetheart. Why not? Did you have a fight? Something like that. Did you apologize? Theodore looked at his 8-year-old daughter, who somehow understood relationships better than he did. I tried. Try harder, Daddy. That's what you always tell me to do. On the 4th day, Theodore's assistant knocked on his office door. Sir, there's someone here to see you. Hazel Hernandez. She doesn't have an appointment, but she says it's personal. Theodore's heart stopped completely. Send her in. Hazel walked into his office, and Theodore watched her take in the space. The floor-to-ceiling windows, the expensive furniture, the view of the city stretching out like a painting. She looked so small standing there in her diner uniform, surrounded by evidence of everything he'd hidden from her. So, this is your real life, she said quietly, walking to the window. Yes. It's nice. She stood there for a long moment, looking out at the skyline. I've never been this high up before. You can see everything from here. Theodore didn't know what to say, so he said nothing. I've been angry at you for 4 days, Hazel continued, still staring out the window. Really, really angry. I told Carlos what happened, and he said you were a jerk who didn't deserve me. He's probably right. He is right. But then I kept thinking about something. Hazel turned to face him, and Theodore saw she'd been crying. You told me the truth. You didn't have to. You could have kept lying, and I never would have known. But you told me anyway. Even though you knew I'd be angry, even though you knew it might end things. I couldn't keep lying to you. Why not? You'd done it for weeks already. Because I love you. The words came out raw and honest, like they'd been torn from somewhere deep inside him. And lying to someone you love isn't love at all. It's just another kind of using them. Hazel's eyes filled with fresh tears. You hurt me, Theodore. I know. I'm so sorry. I don't know if I can trust you again. I know. But I want to try. Hazel wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. I must be crazy, but I want to try. Because the truth is, I fell in love with you too. The real you, underneath all the lies. The guy who listens when I talk about Carlos, the guy who makes Matilda laugh, the guy who kisses me like I'm the only person in the world. Theodore crossed the space between them in 3 steps, pulling Hazel into his arms. She let him, burying her face in his chest, and he felt like he could breathe again for the first time in days. "I don't care about your money," she said, her voice muffled against his shirt. "I never did. I care that you didn't trust me enough to just be yourself." "I was scared. I know, I'm scared too." Hazel pulled back to look at him, her face streaked with tears but determined. "But if we're going to do this, no more lies, no more tests, just us, figuring it out together." "Just us," Theodore agreed, meaning it more than he'd ever meant anything. "I promise." "And you're paying me back for all those dinners." Theodore laughed, the sound breaking through the tension like sunlight through storm clouds. "Deal." Hazel smiled then, tentative but real. "Also, Carlos wants to meet the real you. Fair warning, he's going to give you so much grief about this." "I deserve it." "Yeah, you do." Hazel kissed him softly, sweetly, like a promise. "But you're going to make it up to us. Both of us. However long it takes." 6 months later, Theodore stood in his kitchen making Saturday morning pancakes while Matilda and Carlos argued over what to watch on TV. The argument was heated but friendly. Something about whether space documentaries or nature shows were more educational. "Black holes are just boring," Carlos was saying. "They're like space vacuums." "Black holes are the coolest part of space," Matilda protested. "They can bend time." "That's exactly why they're boring. Too weird to be real." Hazel was curled up on the couch between them, a medical journal in her lap as she researched new treatments for Carlos's condition. She'd cut back to 40 hours a week at the diner, her choice because she liked the work and the people, but now she actually had time to breathe, time to read, time to just exist without the constant weight of financial panic. Theodore had set up a trust for Carlos's medical expenses, not because Hazel had asked, she hadn't, would never ask, but because it was the right thing to do. Because family took care of family, and somehow, against all odds, they'd become exactly that. "Daddy, tell Carlos that black holes are cool," Matilda called out. "I'm staying out of this one," Theodore replied, flipping a pancake. "You two figure it out." "Smart man," Hazel said, catching his eye from across the room. She was smiling, that same genuine smile that had stopped his world that first day in the diner. But the exhaustion was gone now, replaced by something that looked like contentment, like home. "I love you," Theodore mouthed silently. "I know," Hazel mouthed back, her smile widening into something that made his chest feel too small to contain everything he felt for her. It wasn't perfect. They still had arguments about money. Hazel hated when Theodore tried to buy her expensive things, said it made her uncomfortable. They still had difficult conversations about trust, about the lies that had started everything. Some days were harder than others, but it was real. Finally, completely, beautifully real. And that was worth more than any test Theodore could have designed, worth more than all the money in his bank account, worth everything, because love, real love, wasn't something you could test or measure or prove. It was something you chose every single day to give and receive with an open heart, even when it scared you, especially when it scared you. And Theodore had never been more terrified or more grateful in his entire life.